First, Tony Blair versus David Fluff Gregory. Why do you call him Fluff? That's just a name-calling thing. What's your deal? Is that because you got all this stuff pent up and you just... No, I always thought that he was less substance, definitely bias, and not a suitable replacement for Tim Russer. He seems to be more of a fluff. His analysis is thin, and I believe you brought on the Daily Kos to the panel, so once you start doing that kind of thing. But I digress. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair took aim at David Gregory after David Gregory, out of nowhere, starts talking about Iraq and the fact that the Iraq war is to blame for terrorism. I'll play this for you. Yes. Roll it.
No, Syria isn't the legacy of your leadership and that of President Bush, in part responsible for the reality today. To wit, I mean this. I have spoken to writers, other journalists, leaders. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates writes in his memoir, Afghanistan was the proving ground for Islamic fundamentalism in the Muslim world. And by invading Iraq, there was necessarily a transfer of tremendous resources to fight the war in Iraq. And today, the Taliban is resurgent and still very powerful in Pakistan and could be once again in Afghanistan. So part one to that. Right. Did President Bush, did the West fail to deal with the extremism you talk about today appropriately in Afghanistan in a sustainable way?
I think we did, but I think we've got to recognize one thing very, very clearly. This is a long battle, right? The best way to look at this is to take an analogy probably with something like revolutionary communism or even fascism. In other words, this ideology is not going to be defeated by an engagement in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or even in these individual arenas. It's going to be defeated over a long period of time.
And then Gregory cuts in with another question to the former prime minister and cites the former head of the MI5 in Great Britain. And she talks about, quote, in my view, she says, whatever the merits of putting the end to Saddam Hussein, the war was also a distraction from the pursuit of al-Qaeda. It increased terrorist threat by convincing more people that Osama bin Laden's claim that Islam was under attack was correct. It provided an arena for jihad for which he had called, so that many of his supporters, including British citizens, traveled back to Iraq to attack Western forces. It also showed very clearly that foreign and domestic policy are intertwined. Actions overseas have an impact at home, unquote. And Gregory picks that up by saying, which is to say that radicalization there will also come home to roost. Roll it.
Which is to say that radicalization there will also come home to roost and affect Great Britain and could indeed affect America.
So we've got to liberate ourselves from this, because we're making a huge error when we end up thinking somehow it's our actions that have caused this. Let's be very clear in Afghanistan and Iraq. You can agree or disagree with either decision. We removed brutal dictatorships, allowed the people a chance to elect their government. They came out in both cases and voted, showing that they wanted such election. We gave them a massive amount of financial support. What was the disruptive effect? The disruptive effect was that very Islamist ideology I'm talking about, on the one side being pushed out of Iran from the Iranian theocracy, on the other side Al-Qaeda and other groups, and they combined to try and destabilize the wishes of the majority of the country. Now, when we weren't involved, as in Syria, they're still going and fighting jihad there. So you can carry on explaining all this by saying it's us, we provoked them, you know, it's really, they're just trying to react against Western imperialism. It's nonsense. If it were the case, for example, that the reason why they were engaged in this terrorism in Iraq was because of the presence of American troops or British troops, you would expect when we'd get out, the terrorism would stop. It doesn't. It doesn't because it's not coming from us. Right. It's coming from this ideology, and we aren't going to defeat it until we liberate ourselves from the attitude that somehow we're the cause of it.
That's a very good point and an excellent answer. But this is a theme. Why did they hate us? Or we're the problem? Or our action of defending freedom robustly is the problem. We'll offend others. We'll cause more by being true to our values of what we stand for. So we must deny those values. We must deny our heritage. We must deny in some way our foundation, our Judeo-Christian foundation, which allows for us to be free. No, I disagree. But you have people who are married to this idea. And it doesn't only exist within the foreign policy realm of fighting terrorism. A side note, Saddam Hussein, 17 UN resolutions, we didn't rush to war, and the reason we had Bush lied, people died, is because we had folks like Democrat Harry Reid, not about R's or D's, but about accountability, sacrifice our national security on the altar of politics. A despicable act, and one I will never forget. I hope you don't either. Because we look at the statements that were made before the Iraq War, and they were the same statements President Bush made. We also must consider the fact that Iraq was handed to President Obama as a victory, and he has turned that into what looks now as a defeat. But we'll get to that a little later. Now I want to zero in here because it's really important to focus in on what our leaders believe. And they don't necessarily share the majority of our country's belief. But this is important because these ideas have consequences.